Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Laetitia Bader, Horn of Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. And she joined me to talk about a report that Human Rights Watch has published yesterday on Western Tigray, titled Ethnic Cleansing Persists Under Tigray Truce, where they make the point that ethnic cleansing has been undergoing the last couple of months. And thank you for joining me, Laetitia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So maybe why don't we start with you giving us a brief summary of the main points that you make in the new report, Laetitia?
So basically, this report looks at what's been happening in Western Tigray zone over the last year. We had released a report with Amnesty International April last year, and we let off basically at a point where there had been new waves of arrests of Tigrayans in Western Tigray zone. And in that report, we had been warning that they risked being held in terrible conditions. We'd documented how the conditions were deteriorating very rapidly. And so what this report looks into is what has been happening over the last year. So we spoke to over 30 people, many of them who had been detained, particularly in detention facilities in Amhara, 4 detention facilities in particular there. And many of them had actually been arrested in the last wave of mass detentions we had documented in late 2021. So what we found was, again, terrible detention conditions, overcrowding, very limited access to food, to water, to medication. We spoke to a number of detainees who saw co-detainees dying inside of the facilities. We documented 2 instances where the guards in the detention facilities executed detainees following 2 prison breaks. And so we documented the cases of at least 6 people who were executed in the facilities. And then we also looked at what has been 2 new rounds of forced expulsions, primarily from the detention facilities directly, but also from residents of the town in November 2022, shortly after the signing of the cessation of hostilities, and another round again in January this year. And so what we see here and what we find from these interviews highlights very clearly how the ethnic cleansing campaign, which we have documented since the beginning of this conflict, which amounts to crimes against humanity and war crimes, has continued since the cessation of hostilities. So obviously very concerned about the lives of those who've been forcibly expulsed. Many of them are now internally displaced in other parts of Tigray. We did speak to a number of individuals, including a woman, for example, who more recently has fled into Sudan, who described how even up until about March this year, after these new rounds of forced expulsions, local administrations, Amhara forces have continued to threaten Tigrayans who have found in one way or another still found themselves in the zone. So really highlighting how this atmosphere, these threats, these direct abuses have continued.
All right. Thank you, Laetitia. So people who listening to you now describe the things that have been happening in Western Tigray, and people who have been following the kind of atrocities that have been unleashed for the past 2 years in Western Tigray and also in Tigray in general, would say that all the things would amount to genocide, but the term you have settled for is ethnic cleansing. And indeed, nobody has so far really said that genocide might be the thing that has been committed in Tigray. What needs to happen in your opinion, or maybe in human rights view, for you to entertain the possibility that maybe it is genocide that is happening?
I mean, I think a few things are important to underscore. We've obviously been repeatedly asked this question, is that there isn't a hierarchy of serious international crimes. Crimes against humanity are serious international crimes, which require a concerted response from, obviously, governments in question who are responsible under international human rights and humanitarian law, but also the international community. So what we have been documenting in Western Tigray zone and the abuses which formed part of this ongoing ethnic cleansing campaigns amount to crimes against humanity. These are very serious crimes. And what we have repeatedly said, though, is that there needs to be and there should be ongoing in-depth investigations into what happened there. So we do not say that the findings of more investigations could determine that genocide has happened, but what we have found and the basis of our research and our findings points to the very serious crimes against humanity and war crimes. And they need to be treated as such. And this is where, of course, we continue to underscore that there is a responsibility of the Ethiopian federal government, but also of the international community to press for credible, real, meaningful accountability for these very serious crimes that have been happening. But we do say, I mean, as we speak, this area is still very much cut off. There is very limited humanitarian access. There is no real access for independent journalists, human rights monitors, human rights investigators. People are not getting in. And this is, again, where we continue to underscore that access would be a sign of commitments around accountability, but we're not even seeing that. As you know, the government had committed as part of the interministerial task force to carry out in their third phase of investigations also in Western Tigray zone. To date, we have no information from the federal government around their plans, around the time frame. They were supposed to report on that by December. That hasn't happened. And these are the sort of questions that international partners of Ethiopia that have increasingly argued that they see commitments on the part of the federal government towards investigations. These are the tough questions that need to be asked, and this is the pressure that needs to be made publicly and also privately. And, you know, one of the key findings of our report is that two of the individuals, so we had named 3 individuals in particular in our first report with Amnesty International, who were overseeing or directly involved in the abuses in this area. 2 of them came up again and again in our interviews, either again in positions of power or in the case of one individual in particular being directly involved in some of the abuses in the detention facilities. That raises real questions around commitments to stop the abuses. This is not even a question of investigating abuses. This is to stop the abuses. If they have remained in those positions, they continue to be in a position of power. And these are really the tough questions that need to be asked.
So you, in your previous report, I think it was a couple of months ago, I don't quite remember, you singled out 2 notorious individuals responsible for really, really heinous crimes in Western Tigray. And you mentioned those 2 individuals in your yesterday's report as well. And they haven't faced anything. The government hasn't tried to bring them to justice. If anything, actually, I think one of them has been promoted in terms of position. One of them is now zone administrator in Western Tigray, of course, under Amhara control now. And I think one question that many people will have listening to this, I mean, you're saying that you don't rule anything out, you are calling for more in-depth investigation to determine the nature of the crimes, whether it's genocide or other things, and that's fair enough. But in the report, you call on the Ethiopian government to be more serious, but you know from your interactions with them that the Ethiopian government doesn't take these things seriously. They haven't even responded to your request for them to give their version of the story. And why do you seem to have confidence in the Ethiopian government to take the issue of justice and accountability seriously?
I mean, an absolutely key question. And of course, it is important to underscore once again that it is the responsibility of the federal government to investigate. Federal government forces have been present in Western Tigray zone since the beginning. They have been, in some cases, and we documented this in our first report, directly involved in some of the abuses in the abusive detention facilities. We had a handful of incidents where they were also involved in the forced expulsions. They have a responsibility. But of course, why we have continued to press for international investigations and for the government and others to press for access for international investigations is that we do believe that there needs to be more, and there needs to be an international involvement in the investigations that still need to happen. I mean, this is where I understand the frustrations in terms of feelings that people sense that there is enough now available to know the scale, but more investigations are important. More preservation of evidence is important. And this is where key partners of Ethiopia cannot turn a blind eye to what we lay out in this report, which are clearly signs that there is a lack of commitment on the part of the Ethiopian federal government to investigating, to allowing credible investigations, and this should be raising questions about their commitment in terms of domestic accountability for what has happened in Western Tigray zone. And so, yes, we are calling on them to do this, but it is absolutely critical that ongoing failure to carry out these credible investigations is not ignored. And I think this is one of our concerns right now, is that it does appear increasingly to be ignored, and that cannot be the case.
All right. So knowing what you know, your experience, you have written multiple reports on Western Tigray and about Tigray in general the past 3 years. Do you have any sort of hope that the victims of Tigray will get some sort of justice, whether that is from the Ethiopian government or from the international community? Or do you have worries that the whole thing would be brushed aside and people will just move on?
I mean, we are very worried. I think, the signs at the moment in terms of international as well as federal government's commitment towards accountability seems to be waning. And this is where we are underscoring that the prioritization of accountability, which was made very early on from the EU, for example, needs to be maintained, and it cannot be brushed under the carpet because of other improvements. And we have to be frank in terms of there have been improvements, for example, in terms of humanitarian access since the cessation of hostilities. There is still a long way to go, even in the areas where there have been some openings and some improvements. But I think what is critical, and this is where there is also a responsibility on the side of the interim Tigrayan authorities, for example, is it is going to be critical for there to be ongoing space for communities who have been most affected by what has been happening to voice their concerns. I mean, again and again in our research, people call for credible investigations and accountability. This is not just a message coming from us. Obviously, this is something we repeatedly call for in many contexts, but obviously when we're talking about the scale of abuses that we are talking about here, but it is also critical that voices can be heard. And I think there is a more general concern that the cessation of hostilities have been negotiated at a very elite level, that key voices have not been part of the process. And so this is obviously something which needs to happen to make it harder. As we know, again and again in different contexts, victims' voices are overlooked. And this we see throughout the world. But I think it is absolutely critical, and there is a responsibility also on the Tigrayan interim administration side to make sure that those voices can be heard. And it's also important for the international community to go out of their way to listen to those calls and not to just listen to certain sections of the population, and to really make an effort to hear what communities most affected are calling for.
Yeah. So if we could, just one more question. I'm aware of how tight your schedule is, Laetitia, so I'm going to let you go. But one more question in terms of Ethiopia. You will be aware that there are now conflicts everywhere, including apparently in Addis Ababa. There has been shootings in mosques today, and there is some sort of a low-key war in the Amhara region, and lots of atrocities that we read on a daily basis. Is this something that you're keeping an eye on, or the focus so far has been just Tigray?
No, absolutely. I mean, and it is again where we are pressing the international community to ensure that there is not a return to normal relationships in a context of multiple human rights crises. There were already multiple human rights crises in Ethiopia before the conflict started. And this is something we have been arguing, underscoring, documenting for some time. And so the pressure needs to happen, of course, on events in Tigray, improvements in Tigray, etc. But the oversight, the monitoring, the questioning of security force behavior, of government responses, etc., needs to happen in many different places. And I think one of the trends we have seen for many years now, we probably had about 6 months of opening in late 2018, where there was a tiny bit more space for critical voices to be heard, etc. But we are again seeing an environment in which it is very difficult for different views to be heard. The space for criticism has shrunk significantly again. And all these factors need to be taken into account in terms of the international response and engagement with the federal government and the regional governments as well.
Yes, but you view, in terms of the rapprochement process by the international community and the Ethiopian government, do you believe that there has been sort of a prioritization of the normalization of relations with the Ethiopian regime, and not as much emphasis on holding people to account, on ensuring that there is a peace and there is a justice and accountability mechanism? What is your assessment? And that would be my final question.
Yeah, I mean, and we have been quite clear that, for example, at the EU level, recent decisions and statements have, in our opinion, not underscored the need for credible investigations to the extent that we would like to see. We have obviously said very publicly that we believe that it is essential for the EU and other countries to continue to support the renewal of the mandate of the International Commission for Human Rights experts at the level of Geneva. These commitments cannot be put on the side. And I think this is where we are concerned at the moment, that they are increasingly being downplayed, but at a time, as you described, that there is a need for oversight, there is a need for investigations in many different places. And as we know, if the cycles of impunity will continue, we will continue to see new crises and new resentments and new feelings of marginalization and instability as well. And so again, putting accountability on the back burner or under the rug is not the approach. And that's why we continue to argue, in terms of your engagement with the Ethiopian government, it is critical to continue to press for concrete steps and measures and commitments, and start, for example, by allowing the International Commission to do their work, allowing them access. And this should absolutely be a warning sign if that isn't happening, which it hasn't been happening.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. So that was Laetitia Bader, Horn of Africa Director of Human Rights Watch. And thank you for the listen. Goodbye. So that was it.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I think it was exactly 20 minutes.